Hello, my name is Dina Massachi. I've been obsessed with The Wizard of Oz since I was a kid, and I've had the good luck of turning this obsession into a career as I teach The Wizard of Oz at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Over the past several summers, I've had the pleasure of speaking at our International Wizard of Oz Club conventions. While I'm going to miss having conversations and grabbing meals with all of you, I'm glad that Jane was able to arrange this virtual space for us. This year marks the 35th anniversary of Disney's Return to Oz, a fascinating attempt at both a Disney version of Oz and a sequel to the MGM film. I say fascinating because, like many Oz films, it had disappointing box office returns, but eventually became a cult classic. We, the Oz community, are uniquely equipped to understand why this film has a cult following. What we might not understand is the numerous internet sources that claim that this film has scarred children for life. Let's explore this claim. In order to narrow my scope, I'm going to use Lindsay Romaine's 2018 article from The Nerdist, which identifies 5 scary scenes. If you'd actually like to watch the scenes, I recommend checking out the article on The Nerdist or sticking around for the watch-along. Rather than move in the order in which Romaine presents the scenes, I'm going to move in chronological order from the film, making the first scary scene the electroshock therapy that Dorothy undergoes. Dorothy's aunt and uncle believe that Oz is a delusion and take her to a doctor to get some help. The scene that Romaine mentions shows Dorothy being strapped to a gurney by a nurse played by Jean Marsh and then wheeled to a room where a doctor, played by Nicole Williamson, tells her all about the electroshock therapy he is about to perform. The lights go out before Dorothy can receive her treatment. I think we can all agree with Romaine that the scene is quite scary. It also is the only scene we will look at that does not originate from Baum's Oz series. In Baum's 14 Oz novels, Oz is a real place. When Dorothy returns to Oz in Baum's 3rd novel, Ozma of Oz, she is traveling with Uncle Henry to Australia. The novel opens on a ship. The first sentence is, "The wind blew hard and joggled the water of the ocean, sending ripples across its surface." If you are unfamiliar with Baum's 3rd Oz novel, you can probably guess how Dorothy arrives in Oz. Like the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, a storm takes her. Also like Baum's Wonderful Wizard, the reader does not spend much time in the real world. Dorothy arrives in Baum's fairyland as soon as possible, which doesn't leave much space for real-world horrors. Further, like the Wonderful Wizard, Dorothy isn't scared. Baum tells his readers that many children in her place would have wept and given way to despair, but because Dorothy had encountered so many adventures and come safely through them, it did not occur to her at this time to be especially afraid. Since Dorothy, Baum's every child, isn't scared, the reader doesn't experience this emotion. Despite having the rights to 13 of the 14 Baum titles, Disney's Return to Oz decided to create a sequel of MGM's Wizard of Oz, which meant that Dorothy's slippers are ruby, Oz was a dream from which Dorothy awoke, and Return to Oz spends a lot of time in Kansas. This is not the musical Kansas of MGM or the 1902 stage show that MGM borrowed from, though. As David and Karen Dykett point out in their Baum Bugle article, Did Dorothy Return to Oz? During the 1980s, the live-action musical was dead. Return to Oz borrows from the French New Wave genre instead. This means that director Walter Murch wanted to convey the real-world problems of a real-world Dorothy. If Dorothy were to divulge her magical experience in Oz to family and friends, they would think she was crazy. The Dyketts do a beautiful job exploring this further in their article, and I don't want to steal their thunder. The important takeaway here is that when you remove the musical elements from the MGM film and leave Oz as a dream, you're left with horrors like electroshock therapy. While there are ways that this might add to the story, there are also ways that this bit of horror misses Baum's intentions, and perhaps his intended audience. In the introduction to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum claims that the story aspires to being a modernized fairy tale in which the wonderment and joy are retained and the heartaches and nightmares are left out. Electroshock therapy certainly does not leave the horrors and nightmares out. Every other scene on Lindsay Romaine's list does come from Baum's Oz, though, which provides us with the opportunity not only to explore claims that Return to Oz is a kid's horror film, but also horror within L. Frank Baum's Oz series. Did Baum forget his aspirations to write a fairy tale where the heartaches and nightmares were left out? Do the film's visual depictions and blending of two of Baum's Oz novels change the tale? Or did Baum have a trick for making the scary moments palatable and family-friendly that Disney's Return to Oz missed? Continuing chronologically, the next scary scene from Romaine's list is a quick scene after Dorothy arrives in Oz and the gnomes inform their king of this fact. As Romaine states, the Gnome King's rock guards act as a surveillance team and communicate through the surface of his lair's rocky exterior. The way this one's face morphs and distorts, coupled with his scary voice, is totally unsettling. Not to mention the way he barks, "She has a chicken with her." Have the words "a chicken" ever been this terrifying? There are a few things to unpack in this. The first is the mention of surveillance. Oz functions as something of a utopia. I won't dive too deep down this rabbit hole, as I just gave a talk for OzCon International's virtual convention that explored utopias, dystopias, and Oz. But this type of literature tends to have some sort of a panopticon, or the idea of constantly being watched or monitored embedded within it. In Baum's Oz, Glinda's Great Book of Records records all Oz happenings and warns the good rulers of any dangers coming their way, providing an example of something that might be considered good government surveillance. Return to Oz's use of rocks as spies functions as the complete opposite. This is undoubtedly bad surveillance, which explains Romaine's unsettled feelings. The morphing and distorting directly relates to the claymation, which, like the use of puppets instead of heavily costumed actors from MGM, makes Return to Oz something of a product of its time. While claymation has been around since the beginning of the 20th century in one form or another, and began to find an audience with Art Chalky's Gumby, classic cell animation was preferred. A claymation resurgence came in the late 1970s and continued into the 1980s, just before CGI became popular in the 1990s. In addition to claymation, the film relied heavily on puppets. This is important to note because it links Return to Oz to other 80s kids' movies that might be called scary, such as The Never-Ending Story, The Labyrinth, and The Dark Crystal. In fact, the voice of Jack Pumpkinhead was provided by Brian Henson, who also voiced the Labyrinth's Hoggle. Bellina the Chicken was voiced by Dennis Breyer, who also voiced the Labyrinth's Junk Lady. The Tin Man at the end of Return to Oz was played by Deep Roy, who was also Teeny Weeny in The Never-Ending Story, noting because it contextualizes Return to Oz as a film of its time. While Romaine might find the distorting of claymation unsettling, the film was nominated for the 1986 Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. On this one note, Romaine might be alone. The third item worth noting is the fact that gnomes are afraid of chickens, because in Baum's world, eggs poison gnomes. While both versions of Oz share this tidbit, Baum offers it to his audience with humor, which we can see in the scene near the end of Baum's Ozma of Oz when Bellina lays an egg and then uses the Gnome King's fear in order to negotiate with him. "You don't understand," retorted the little monarch nervously. "Eggs belong only to the outside world, to the world on the Earth's surface where you came from. Here in my underground kingdom, they are rank poison, as I said, and we gnomes can't bear to be around them." "Well, you'll have to bear to be around this one," declared Bellina, "for I've laid it." "Where?" asked the king. "Under your throne," said the hen. The king jumped 3 feet in the air, so anxious was he to get away from the throne. Take it away at once," he shouted. "I can't," said Bellina. "I haven't any hands." In just a moment, we'll explore the contrast of horror and humor in each version of Oz. For now, I ask you to remember that Baum was a feminist. His mother-in-law, Matilda Gage, was a founding member of the National Women's Suffrage Association, and Baum became the secretary of a small Aberdeen equal suffrage club when his family lived in that Dakota territory. Eggs function as a symbol of female fertility. In her Baum Bugle article, Beneath the Surface of Ozma of Oz, Suzanne Rand argues that the Gnome King is a distinctly American kind of monarch, the industrial capitalist whose power resides in the monopoly he controls. Baum's Gnome King is the patriarchy. Eggs, female fertility, is deadly to gnomes, the patriarchy. Returning to Romaine's list and the idea of horror and humor, the next chronological scene is the introduction of the Wheelers. Bellina and Dorothy realize they are in Oz and begin exploring. Nothing is quite as Dorothy left it. Oz is in ruins, there is paint warning passerbyers to beware the Wheelers, and people are stone statues. Then Dorothy and the audience hear a sound that is quite similar to the sound of the gurney being wheeled down the hall of the mental hospital, and the Wheelers are introduced. Their voices are gravelly, their laughs manic, and their feet have wheels that give them an otherworldly speed as they begin to chase Dorothy and her chicken. This scene is fairly similar to the introduction of the Wheelers in Ozma of Oz. Dorothy turned quickly around and saw coming out of a path that led from between the trees the most peculiar person her eyes had ever beheld. It had the form of a man, except that it walked, or rather rolled, upon all fours, and its legs were the same length as its arms, giving them the appearance of the four legs of a beast. Yet it was no beast that Dorothy had discovered, for the person was clothed most gorgeously in embroidered garments of many colors, and wore a straw hat perched jauntily upon the side of its head. But it differed from human beings in this respect, that instead of hands and feet, there grew at the end of its arms and legs round wheels, and by means of these wheels, it rolled very swiftly over the level ground. "Run!" screamed the hen, fluttering away in great fright. "It's a Wheeler!" Certainly, the terrifying laugh that Pons Mars offers adds a horrifying element that comes from a change in medium. Readers have no way of knowing what Baum meant by a sharp, wild cry. However, this talk offers a change in medium as well. You can't hear Pons Mars laugh right now, which probably makes the scene seem rather similar at first glance. Does this mean that Baum wrote horrors and nightmares into his tales, ignoring his aspirations? For this particular scene, the answer returns us to the MGM film. The vast majority of the world thinks of Margaret Hamilton when they think of the Wicked Witch of the West. Hamilton's witch is an otherworldly green with a terrifying laugh. She is also Dorothy's main antagonist within Oz, popping up everywhere, causing the hardships that Dorothy and her companions must face. In the making of The Wizard of Oz, Al Jean Harmits notes that screenwriter Noel Langley created this version of the witch. Baum's Wicked Witch of the West doesn't come into his Oz story until chapter 12, which is the only chapter in which she appears. She doesn't care about Dorothy until she wanders into her land. Baum's Wicked Witch of the West is introduced with this description. Now, the Wicked Witch of the West had but one eye, yet that was as powerful as a telescope and could see everywhere. So as she sat at the door of her castle, she happened to look around and saw Dorothy lying asleep with her friends about her. They were a long distance off, but the Wicked Witch of the West was angry to find them in her country. Even though Baum's Wonderful Wizard of Oz was not created as a film, thanks to the illustrations by William Wallace Denslow, readers do have a visual of Baum's one-eyed witch, and that visual is humorous. She has an eye patch over her bad eye, 3 braids sticking out of her head in various directions, and she carries an umbrella instead of a stereotypical broom like Hamilton's witch. Baum's love for comical illustrations is well documented in Michael Patrick Hearn's introduction to his annotated Wizard of Oz, including a time that Baum wrote his publisher stating, "What we need is more humorous pictures." Even without the pictures, though, Baum repeatedly tells his reader how comically harmless his witch is. She is described as both surprised and worried and trembling in fear when she meets Dorothy. Readers that are told that she is afraid of the dark and that she had a dread of water too. Baum may introduce the horrors of a witch that captures and enslaves Dorothy, but by adding plenty of humor along the way, Baum avoids making that horror into heartaches and nightmares. Baum's signature blend of horror and humor plays out in his Wheelers as well. Let's look again at Baum's initial description of the Wheelers. It was no beast that Dorothy had discovered, for the person was clothed most gorgeously in embroidered garments of many colors, and wore a straw hat perched jauntily upon the side of its head. But it differed from human beings in this respect, that instead of hands and feet, there grew at the end of its arms and legs round wheels, and by means of these wheels, it rolled very swiftly over the level ground. Afterward, Dorothy found that these odd wheels were the same hard substance that her fingernails and toenails are composed of. But when our little girl first caught sight of the Wheelers, she had an idea that the brilliantly clothed personage was on roller skates, which were attached to his hands as well as his feet. While the readers are warned about the Wheelers, both from writing that tells everyone to beware the Wheelers and from Bellina, their description makes them seem like overdressed men with toenail roller skates. Return to Oz's Wheelers, with their metal helmets, complete with Medusa-like metal hair and creepy faces, lack the jaunty straw hat and colorful clothing that adds a touch of humor. Undoubtedly, Return to Oz's Wheelers looks scary. While Baum's description of the Wheelers walks the border between horror and humor, Baum had another trick to make the scary parts less scary. Baum claimed in his 1909 article, Modern Fairy Tales, that what children want is action, something to do every minute, exciting adventures, unexpected difficulties to be overcome, and marvelous escapes. And Baum's stories are notably free from lengthy descriptive passages. This combination of action and a lack of lengthy descriptive passages means that Baum is able to resolve the scary parts as quickly as he brings them in. Returning to the page on which we just read the description of the Wheelers, Bellina tells Dorothy to climb up this hill quick. Wheelers reached the hill a moment after her, but while the little girl scrambled up the rocks, the creature stopped short with a howl of rage and disappointment. Dorothy now heard the yellow hen laughing in her cackly, henny way. "Don't hurry, my dear," cried Bellina. "They can't follow us among these rocks, so we're safe enough now." Dorothy is able to escape the dangers within a few sentences of its introduction, all because of the Wheelers' silly hands and feet. While Return to Oz's Dorothy runs from the Wheelers, it takes her a lot longer than a few sentences to get away. Humor and speed keeps Baum's Oz from crossing into the scary place that Murch takes his Oz. Further, readers learn later that Baum's Wheelers, like Baum's Wicked Witch of the West, come across as scarier than they really are. Being so helpless, our only hope is to make people afraid of us by pretending we are very fierce and terrible and writing in the sand warnings to beware the Wheelers. Baum offers a lesson to his readers. Baum's Wheelers, much like Baum's False Wizard in his first Oz novel, press the reader to question false assumptions and look beyond what is presented in order to find the real qualities within. Because Return to Oz chooses to echo MGM rather than Baum, this lesson is missing from the film. The next scene on Romaine's list is Princess Mombi's castle, or, more specifically, her collection of heads. Return to Oz's main female villain, played by Jean Marsh, the same actress who played the nurse in the mental hospital, is a princess who has a collection of heads that she rotates the way you or I might change a shirt. In the scene that Romaine identifies, Dorothy tries to escape from Mombi at night by stealing the powder of life in which Mombi keeps locked up with her original head. Dorothy tiptoes through the light-up closet of heads, unlocks the cabinet with the sleeping Mombi head, and reaches for the powder. Mombi's head wakes up screaming, waking up the other heads, which also begin to scream. Her headless body starts toward Dorothy as the clip cuts. Undoubtedly, this is terrifying. It also isn't as true to Baum's Ozma of Oz as the Wheelers were. In Ozma of Oz, Baum has a princess named Langwidere who has a collection of heads. Now, I must explain to you that the Princess Langwidere had 30 heads, as many as there are days in the month. But of course, she could only wear one of them at a time because she had but one neck. These heads were kept in what she called her cabinet, which was a beautiful dressing room that lay just between Langwidere's sleeping chamber and the mirrored sitting room. Each head was in a separate cupboard lined with velvet. The cupboard ran all around the sides of her dressing room and had elaborately carved doors with golden numbers on the outside and jeweled frame mirrors on the inside of them. Though the reader might find the description of 30 heads and one neck a little funny, Baum does set this princess up as something of a villain when he tells his readers that there was only one trouble with number 17, the temper that went with it. It was fiery, harsh, and haughty in the extreme, and often led the princess to do unpleasant things which she regretted when she came to wear her other heads. But she did not remember this today, and went to meet her guests in the drawing room with a feeling of certainty she would surprise them with her beauty. Sure enough, Langwidere with head number 17 creates trouble for Dorothy when she decides she wants her head. "Come nearer to me." Dorothy obeyed without a thought of fear and stood before the princess while Langwidere examined her face with careful attention. "You are rather attractive," said the lady presently. "Not at all beautiful, you understand, but you have a certain style of prettiness that is different from any of my 30 heads. So I believe I'll take your head and give you number 26 for it." "Well, I believe you won't," exclaimed Dorothy. "You refuse?" cried the princess with a frown. "Of course I do," was the reply. "Then," said Langwidere, "I shall lock you up in a tower until you decide to obey me." These excerpts from Baum's Ozma of Oz read quite similar to Return to Oz's initial introduction of Mombi, who locks Dorothy up with the intent of taking her head when she is old enough. The major difference between the two relates both to Dorothy's escape and the Gnome King. In the clip discussed by Romain, Dorothy attempts to steal Mombi's powder of life in order to escape her imprisonment. While Baum does explore this storyline in his second Oz novel, The Marvelous Land of Oz, it is Tip, not Dorothy, who steals the powder of life from Mombi, who is not exactly a witch because the good witch who rules that part of the Land of Oz had forbidden any other witch to exist in her dominions. Baum's Mombi is not the same as Langwidere or Return to Oz's Mombi. Further, the relationship between Baum's Tip and Mombi is different than the relationship between Return to Oz's Mombi and Dorothy. Tip is something of a servant to Mombi, though Baum tells his readers that they must not suppose he worked all the time, for he felt that that would be bad for him. Baum's readers are again given a not-so-scary witch who sort of holds a child in something like servitude. Tip decides to run away when Mombi expresses a desire to turn him into a marble statue after he pulls a prank on her, but his departure doesn't hold any of the terror of Dorothy's escape and return to Oz. While Murch borrows Mombi's name and her powder of life, and her ability to turn people into statues, as well as Langwidere's multiple heads, he merges these scenes and lingers on them until they become something uniquely scary. While we can connect the Baum threads that led to Return to Oz's Mombi, there is one arching Baum theme that is ignored. As I mentioned earlier with Bellina's eggs, Baum was a feminist. Baum's Mombi acted alone, but Murch's Mombi acted on the Gnome King's behalf. I could dive further into this rabbit hole and discuss how Baum's boy hero Tip is really Ozma, the girl ruler of Oz, a gender-bending plotline which Murch ignored, but this line of thought detracts from the humor and horror that this talk focuses on. What is important about Mombi as a subservient witch within Return to Oz is that all of the villains and their actions are linked. There is a clear path from Dorothy in the Asylum to Dorothy in Oz, as the main Oz characters, like the MGM film, have Kansas counterparts. Jean Marsh plays both the part of Mombi and the nurse from the Asylum. Both roles, she serves the main male villain who is really after Dorothy. Baum wrote episodic chapters. His villains, especially in the early Oz novels, rarely make it through more than a few chapters. Baum's Mombi is active in the first 2 chapters of The Marvelous Land of Oz, and then she returns in the final 4, but the majority of the story is dedicated to an entirely different plot line about the Scarecrow, General Ginger, and who should be the ruler of Oz. Ozma of Oz follows a similar setup. Though Langwidere seems like a logical villain for the novel, she is quickly dismissed when Ozma shows up and rescues Dorothy, who then joins Ozma on the real adventure to rescue the royal family of Ev from the Gnome King. Like the wonderful Wizard of Oz, Baum does not have one antagonist who drives the plot. Instead, he has multiple, unlinked challenges for his heroes to overcome. These episodes offer both breaks in the tension and a chance for action every minute. While Return to Oz is not short on action, it does not offer many breaks in tension or chances for humor. Murch's Dorothy escapes Mombi only to land at the Gnome King's front door. In Baum's Ozma of Oz, Dorothy is freed, and Dorothy, Ozma, and their companions, and Langwidere, who has been chastised by Ozma and turned into something of an ally, have a meeting in which the following exposition is provided for the reader. Word came to our noble and illustrious ruler, Ozma of Oz, that the wife and 10 children of the former King of Ev had been enslaved by the Gnome King and are held prisoners in his underground palace. Naturally, our Ozma wished to undertake the adventure of liberating the poor prisoners, but for a long time she could find no way to cross the great desert between the two countries. Finally, she went to Glinda the Good, who presented Ozma a magic carpet which would continually unroll beneath our feet so to make a comfortable path for us to cross the desert. As soon as she received the carpet, our gracious ruler ordered me to assemble our army, which I did. Ozma and her companions embark on a journey to the Gnome King's domain, where they have their first encounter with the gnomes. While these gnomes have not been following them the way the gnomes in Return to Oz continually spy on Dorothy, they do share that morphed, distorted look. As Baum's heroes seek entrance to the Gnome King's domain, suddenly they heard a shout of jeering laughter and stopped short. "Who was that laughing?" asked Ozma. There was no reply, but in the gloom they could see a strange form flit across the face of the rock. Whatever the creature might be, they seemed very like the rock itself, for they were the color of the rocks, and their shape were rough and rugged, as if they had been broken away from the side of the mountain. "Do not mind them," said Tick-Tock as Dorothy shrank back. "They are only the gnomes." In many ways, this scene seems similar to the gnomes in Return to Oz. We have the morphing, the distorting, and a scary laugh. We even have a fearful Dorothy, and while I did not quote it, many of Ozma's soldiers are afraid as well. However, this scene quickly becomes a humorous exchange about manners, as someone in the party has to politely request access to the Gnome King. True to his blend of horror and humor, Baum doesn't linger on the scary gnomes. While Dorothy and her friends gain access to the Gnome King, he is described as a little fat man clothed in gray-brown garments that were the exact color of the rock throne in which he was seated. His bushy hair and flowing beard were also colored like the rocks, and so was his face. He wore no crown of any sort, and his only ornament was a broad, jewel-studded belt that encircled his fat little body. As for his features, they seemed kindly and good-humored, and his eyes were turned merrily upon his visitors. "Why, he looks just like Santa Claus, only he isn't the same color," whispered Dorothy to her friend, but the Gnome King heard the speech, and it made him laugh aloud. Baum's Gnome King, while evil enough to kidnap the royal family of Ev, looks like Santa. He comes across as harmless and humorous. Even when he threatens Ozma and her soldiers, the descriptions remain light and tinted with humor, and the Gnome King remains polite. While Return to Oz shares this character and a slightly altered version of this story arc, as Dorothy is only with a small number of friends and trying to rescue her companions from the Wizard of Oz rather than the royals of Ev, the Gnome King's character is no Santa stand-in. Not only is Return to Oz's Gnome King more bejeweled, and thus outwardly more powerful, but he is also played by Nicole Williamson, the same actor who played the Doctor during Dorothy's electroshock treatment. Further, many of the lines are repeated, making this link impossible to miss. Interestingly, while the echo of the Doctor makes this Gnome King come across as far more sinister, it also resolves a potentially racist element hidden within Baum's work. Some, like Richard Turk in his book Oz in Perspective, argue that Baum's Gnome King is one of Baum's racist depictions. This argument hinges on the observation that Baum emphasized the color of the gnomes in a way he does not in his later Oz books involving the gnomes. Whether good or bad, Return to Oz's predominantly white cast sidesteps this portrayal. Return to Oz and Ozma of Oz offer similar versions of the conflict within the Gnome King's mountain. In Baum's Oz, Ozma and her party are given 11 chances to guess which ornaments in the Gnome King's collection are transformed versions of the F-Royals. In Murch's film, Dorothy and her companions are offered 3 guesses to find the Oz characters transformed into ornaments. I asked you to remember that eggs, female fertility, is deadly for gnomes, the patriarchy. And this tidbit plays out in an interesting divergence between the 2 climactic scenes. In Baum's Oz, Dorothy makes 1 correct guess and frees 1 Prince of Ev, but Billina, the chicken, is the one to save all the other Ev rulers, and all of the Oz people trapped when they guessed wrong. This leads to the Gnome King revealing himself as the true bad guy and not a Santa stand-in. The false assumptions the reader has been set up to make recall Baum's false wizard and his wheelers, again pressing the reader to look beyond what is presented in order to find the real qualities within. Baum offers the following reveal scene. As they reached the hall, the doors flew open before them, and then they all stopped and stared into the domed cavern with faces of astonishment and dismay. For the room was filled with the mail-clad warriors of the Gnome King, rank after rank, standing in an orderly array. The electric lights upon their brows gleamed brightly. Their battle axes were poised as if to strike down their foes. Yet they remained motionless as statues, awaiting the word of command. And in the center of this terrible army sat the little king upon his throne of rock. But he neither smiled nor laughed. Instead, his face was distorted with rage, and most dreadful to behold. While Dorothy is still a brave heroine, it is the mother of the eggs that defeats Baum's Gnome King through and through. Billina's correct guess leads to the reveal that the Gnome King isn't who he appears to be, but Baum, true to his blend of horror and humor, breaks the building tension with a humorous scene of Ozma's army's ineptness. Just as Baum's heroes seem trapped, the Scarecrow, as if aroused to action by the valor of the private, drew one of Billina's eggs from his right jacket pocket and hurled it straight at the little monarch's head. It struck him squarely in his left eye, where the egg smashed and scattered, as eggs will, and covered his face and hair and beard with its sticky contents. "Help! Help!" screamed the king, clawing with his fingers at the egg in a struggle to remove it. An egg! Run for your lives!" shouted the captain of the gnomes in a voice of horror. And how they did run! The warriors fairly tumbled over one another in an effort to escape the fatal poison of that awful egg, and those who could not rush down the winding stairs fell off the balcony into the great cavern beneath, knocking over those who stood below them. This scene captures many aspects of Baum's writing. It's funny, it's got a touch of feminism, and the villain is defeated without death. While Baum did kill a villain or two, the Wicked Witch of the West, for example, as Baum's Oz evolves throughout the series, Baum found more creative ways to resolve his conflict, and fewer characters died. As Romaine points out in her Nerdist article, Return to Oz's Gnome King faces a much more horrifying and deadly end. In this scene, the Gnome King attempts to eat Jack Pumpkinhead, who functions a bit like this film's version of the MGM Scarecrow. Billina has been hiding in Jack's head and lays an egg in fear. The Gnome King swallows the egg and dissolves while explaining that he has been poisoned, and all of the other gnomes around him echo the word poison. Romaine notes many scary aspects: the Gnome King's enormous hands, Jack Pumpkinhead's near-death experience, and the ghoulish spectacle that leads up to the Gnome King's demise. Many of these aspects revolve around death, which Baum was beginning to avoid. While the plot lines are similar, the lack of humor and the emphasis on the horror keep the stories from being anything close to the same. In the article L. Frank Baum and Oz, Roger Sale calls the Gnome King Baum's best villain, whose power is never really useful to him or threatening to others, and whose folly and tantrums are much more childish than really malevolent. Return to Oz ignores the potential for humor from the gnomes and their king. In fact, Murch ignores many opportunities to add humor. The majority of children's and family films include a comedic sidekick. While one could argue Jack Pumpkinhead is such a sidekick, his Halloween connections within the Kansas world of the film make many an internet blogger connect him with the 1993 film The Nightmare Before Christmas, suggesting that he is frequently read as more scary than comical. Baum offered his child readers predominantly harmless villains that press the reader to question false assumptions and look beyond what is presented in order to find the real qualities within. By following MGM's decision to make Oz Dorothy's dream, Disney's Return to Oz offers terrifying villains that span two worlds, all without musical numbers or humorous characters to break up the tensions. Although Disney's Return to Oz overlaps its Oz storylines with the plots of Baum's Marvelous Land of Oz and Ozma of Oz, its attempt to be a non-musical sequel to the MGM film and its lack of humor help us to understand why some critics have denounced Disney's Return to Oz as a horror film that has scarred its child viewers. In spite of these claims, it's important to note that many child viewers enjoy a bit of nightmare within their stories. In his book, Oz in Perspective, Richard Turk states, "It is the darkness in Baum's Oz books, the nightmarish stuff, was one of their main attractions to me when I was a child, and still helps make them enjoyable." Turk is not alone. As a child, I was far more upset that Bellina didn't go home with Dorothy at the end of Return to Oz than I was with any of the aforementioned scary items. To contextualize, a child in the 1980s likely read Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and likely watched The Never-Ending Story, The Labyrinth, and The Dark Crystal, all with similarly scary scenes, puppets, and claymation. Perhaps the critics are the sort of adults that aim to sanitize childhood rather than accept children as they are. Like Baum's child heroes, children are often capable of taking things, like a scary film, in stride. If you've made it to the end of this talk, thank you for listening. And thank you to Jane, the International Wizard of Oz Club, and the sponsors of this To Oz event for having me speak. Thank you.